it's important to look at the way politics and society has developed over time in much more recent centuries in Iraq. So in fact, for much of the history of the land that is presently known as Iraq, people did not even self-identify as Sunni or Shia. Instead, throughout the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, your village or region was a much more important component of your identity. In fact, many tribes in Iraq have branches and members that are both Sunni and Shia in the same tribe, and there was no problem with this. So to understand the origins of Sunni-Shia tensions in Iraq, we need to look much, much more recently, and I would argue we need to look really at the 1990s and at post-2003. So what happened in the 1990s? Basically, Saddam Hussein had ruled Iraq since 1979, and this was, as I'm sure we all know, through a very repressive single-party regime. The 1980s were pretty good in Iraq in a relative sense. Provided you were not a political opponent of Saddam Hussein's, it was a pretty decent place to live. The population was highly, highly educated. It was very progressive. There were many, many women in the workforce. In comparison to many other countries in the region, this was a highly developed country. And what happened in the 1990s is the sanctions were instituted after the first Gulf War, and this radically changed the standard of living for the vast majority of the population. Basically, infectious diseases came back, which is usually a sign of underdevelopment. This doesn't normally happen in more developed countries. The education system virtually collapsed. The healthcare system collapsed. Poverty spiked. Many people were suffering from malnutrition. Of course, there was an elite around Saddam Hussein who profited immensely during the sanctions period, but the vast majority of the population really suffered. And there were uprisings, as we know, and growing opposition in various communities in Iraq. And Saddam Hussein started playing the religion card. And this was this is quite a change because up till then, he had really been a very secular leader, Arab nationalist secular leader. And he started playing the religion card and building mosques and emphasizing religiosity. And women really suffered in Iraq at this time. They lost some of their rights. And so he started to whip up sectarian sentiment in the country as well, started favoring Sunnis even more explicitly, and particularly those from his area around Tikrit. So we can think of Saddam Hussein as a cultural entrepreneur if we think of instrumentalist theories of ethnic mobilization. So then fast forward to 2003, the US invades, the state collapses, various key institutions of the state are dismantled, and sect takes on increased importance in daily life and certainly in political life in Iraq. Why? Two factors, really. One is the design of state institutions that the US government was also involved in, and the second is violence perpetrated in the name of sectarian identity. So what am I talking about more specifically? You may recall that Paul Bremer came in with the Coalitional Provisional Authority and established this Iraqi Governing Council, and this council was organized along ethnic and religious lines. In fact, it's worth noting the parallels between Lebanon and Iraq here, because some of the designers of these institutions looked at Lebanese state institutions, which I'll talk about in a minute, and said, aha, that's another multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. Let's take some advice from there and try and design some of the institutions the way we see them in Lebanon. And in fact, you started hearing this phrase in the Arab world, Lubnanat Iraq, which is the Lebanonization of Iraq. So, so that phrase was used to suggest that they were trying to draw up Iraq along the lines of Lebanon. Also there were a number of other institutions developed. There was a draft constitution implemented in 2004 that was based on a very decentralized vision of governance in Iraq, and that left a lot of autonomy for different regions of the country and effectively promoted different forms of governance in the Kurdish area and in the central area that was predominantly Sunni, in the south, and so forth. In addition to this, there was quite a bit of violence that was perpetrated in the name of sectarianism. I shouldn't use the past tense again. It's ongoing. Starting really in 2004, you saw the rise of sectarian militias. So certainly the Al-Qaeda offshoot, Al-Qaeda of Mesopotamia, has been very active, less so now, but more so between 2004 and 2007 or 8. Various Sunni insurgent groups led by former Ba'ath Party members of the party that Saddam Hussein had ruled through in Iraq, also members of the former military. The Mahdi army was a major player in these sectarian battles. This is the militia associated with Muqtada as-Sadr, who's the sort of fiery Shia cleric you may read about quite a bit in the newspapers. So he's a major player in Iraqi politics. So tons of violence, mass killings, destruction. A major turning point was this bombing of the mosque, the Askari Mosque in Samarra in 2006. This is the mosque before the bombing, after the bombing, and reconstruction. And in fact, this is Abu Musab Zarqawi, who was killed by the US in 2007, but he was part of Al-Qaeda of Mesopotamia. And he apparently is quoted as saying that he wanted to bomb this mosque to whip up Shia fervor and anger. I mean, he was definitely an example of a sectarian entrepreneur who purposively targeted something that he knew would enrage the Shia community. This is an extremely important religious site for that community. It's where the 12th Imam is said to have gone into hiding. So it's an extremely important religious site for that community. So what I'm trying to say is that actually it's the conflict that stoked the sectarian tensions, not latent sectarian tensions that just bubbled over, exploded. It's also these state institutions that promoted them. You also see this kind of self-reinforcing process, because what happens during this sectarian conflict is ethnic cleansing and the homogenization of neighborhoods. The same thing happened after the Lebanese Civil War, where neighborhoods are much more homogeneous. You see it very clearly in Beirut. And so whole generations of children are growing up in much more homogeneous neighborhoods now. That's going to happen in Iraq. It's certainly been happening in Lebanon over the last 20 years or so. In short, sectarianism was fomented and constructed wittingly and unwittingly by political leaders and community leaders to their benefit, so that they could gain more control over certain parts of the country and promote their political standing. And of course, there's a lot at stake. There's oil in the country, so there's a lot at stake. I want to skip over some of this, but I just want to say very quickly, without going into too much detail, that another important point to make about contemporary Iraqi politics, it's very much true about Lebanese politics as well, is that much of the infighting occurs within the same religious communities, not across religious lines. So here's Muqtada as-Sadr, a recent photograph, and the Prime Minister of Iraq. And they've had to go through lots of horse trading after the recent elections about who's going to get what ministries and what seats. But before that, they were actually fighting each other in quite bloody conflict. And the Kurds, the two main Kurdish leaders there as well, have been in an ongoing protracted power struggle for years. So to characterize conflict in Iraq or Lebanon as purely along sectarian lines is grossly misleading.